What is up, everybody? This is the Sharp Angles podcast, the Monday edition of the Sharp Angles podcast, where we talk about the waiver wire, we talk about injuries, we talk about everything that's coming up this week, a big week in the football world, Thanksgiving week, 3 games on Thursday, 1 game on Friday. That makes all of the injury conversations a little bit different, a little bit more interesting as we head into this. Is this the holy week, I think, of football? Yes, the holy week of football, Thanksgiving week. And so if I'm talking about all that stuff, injuries and all that, there's only one person to talk about that with, and that is my good friend here, Tucker. How you doing, Tucker?
Doing great, Ray. How are you? How's
Well,
your day been?
I've had it's been interesting. It's been an interesting day. I got a call late llast night, around 12:30, 1 a.m. last night, that my father-in-law had fallen and busted his head open and was getting a bunch of staples in his head. I don't know. So
Our first injury of the
I
pod.
had what'd you say?
So that's our first injury.
That is our first. Yeah, I suppose that is our first injury. I suppose I hadn't. I guess I hadn't really seen staples. I have as many people have noted on my head, and you could see it. When the lighting's a little different. I suppose I have a Harry Potter scar on my face for when I fell out of my bed and hit my head on a dresser, as I believe I was 10 or 11, somewhere in that range. And so that was a whole ordeal that happened there. But I got good old fashioned stitches back in the year of our Lord 1995. We're just getting good old fashioned stitches. But yeah, I went in there into the ER. They were stapling his head together, and I was like, well, that's interesting to see. Got like kind of a Frankenstein thing going, but he's fine. Everything's good. Got him back home. Got him to sleep. Cleaned some carpet, and now here we are to talk about football. It's really a great way to start the festive season.
What kind of stapler were they using? Was it a swing line? Boston? Those were the only brands I know.
It was funny that it looked kind of like an industrial staple gun you would get from Home Depot. It's just like I think I have one of them in my garage somewhere, one of those proper staple guns. But if I'm a little woozy, if I'm a little out of it, that's the reason. Got to spend some time at the hospitals. Everybody enjoys a good hospital trip. It's always fun. But we do actually have, a lot of injury stuff to discuss. Unfortunately, we didn't have, it wasn't a great weekend for injuries. We had some serious ones suffered, and then other maybe kind of some minor ones going this week. We also had a lot of guys that I would say somewhat surprisingly missed last week that I don't think we really expected when you and I were talking on Monday. Top of that list is probably Brock Purdy, who, had a shoulder injury, and the kind of conversation around it at this time last week was, we think he's fine. We assume he'll play. Then he didn't practice all week, didn't end up playing against the Packers. We kind of saw what happened to the 49ers. And I think the news, kind of the reports about him for week 13 coming up appear to be pretty good, but how much can we even trust that? So it's a really kind of tricky situation here with Brock Purdy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a situation where, last week they felt kind of optimistic, even as he missed practice on Wednesday or Thursday. Even going into Friday, there was some optimism that he'll be fine. They're just being cautious with their franchise quarterback, but obviously that's not the case. Chigoziem reported yesterday that he underwent a second MRI on that injured shoulder just to make sure everything is still okay. There's no structural damage to it. So, I mean, the hope is he can certainly play this week. The 49ers have consistently played it off as it's a minor injury, but you have to remember that there's also coach speak, right? And this is the franchise that told us leading into week 1 that Christian McCaffrey was fine. He'd be out there. And it took him 10 weeks, right? 2.5 months to get back on the field. Now, that was a different situation. He had tendonitis in both of his legs, which is unbelievable. Stroke of luck. But yeah, for Brock Purdy, I think it all really comes down to what is he doing on Wednesday heading into the weekend? What's he doing in practice on Wednesday and Thursday? Because I just don't necessarily believe what the coaches are telling us right now.
Yeah, and I think, the Christian McCaffrey thing has us all it has us we all have a post-traumatic kind of syndrome from that, about how much are we trusting this coaching staff, especially since, as you said, at this time last week, it seemed like everything was fine. And then obviously it wasn't. The thing is that there's not really a ton to take from this from a waiver perspective. I mean, the guys that you are going to want to play if Brock Purdy is back, or even if Brock Purdy's not back and you're kind of like forced into it, they're all on rosters. Obviously Christian McCaffrey and George Kittle and Deebo Samuel and Juwan Jennings obviously is now on a lot of rosters, as he should be, given kind of the role that he has there. And so, there's not really much to do with this. Thankfully, the 49ers, they're not one of those teams that are playing earlier. They're playing actually on Sunday night against the Bills, given kind of the way their season is playing out, given where they are in the playoff race, where they are in the division race. That's obviously a very important game. They need Purdy back. I mean, I guess the one kind of takeaway from this is more of like a real football takeaway, which is we can maybe put some of those system quarterback stuff to bed with Brock Purdy, because of kind of what we saw for from Brandon Allen last week. Since Purdy has played 3 games since the Brandon Ayuk injury, he's second among qualifying quarterbacks in EPA per play. He's ninth in yards per attempt. We saw Brandon Allen in that same offense this past week. He was dead last among qualifying quarterbacks in EPA per play. He was 18th in yards per attempt. So obviously Purdy's very important to this offense. This isn't like the CJ Beathard days where you just go, all right, we're just going to plug a new one in. We'll plug Nick Mullins in. We'll kind of figure out how this goes. This is obviously a very different situation. They need him. This is a massive game for them in Buffalo on Sunday night, if I'm remembering the schedule correctly. I just looked to my right, and I think I am. And so they definitely need him to come out there and play. I'm going to guess that he plays, just kind of based on the magnitude of it and the way they've talked about the injury. But yeah, like I think your point about we're all so gun shy from this coaching staff trying to figure out kind of what's going on with these injuries. And the McCaffrey situation is, obviously top of that list. But I feel like we've had some other ones, like George Kittle the week before. It was like the beginning of that week, it was like, all right, yeah, we think you'll probably be fine. By the end of the week, he just wasn't playing. And so, yeah, we have to kind of take everything from this coaching staff with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the 49ers, other coaching staffs
Sure.
do this. But I mean, Brock Purdy's absence on yesterday against the Packers. I mean, 49ers got 11 first downs, lowest ever under Kyle Shanahan, which you mentioned a few of those names, like the quarterbacks that he played with, besides Jimmy Garoppolo, guys like Nick Mullins, CJ Beathard. I mean, the fact that was arguably the worst offensive performance they ever put together with Kyle Shanahan calling plays. I mean, for Brock Purdy, I mean, you mentioned the system quarterback allegations, the idea that maybe he won't get his franchise quarterback contract when it's due. Certainly a big plus for Brock Purdy when it comes to negotiations. But yeah, I mean, you kind of look at this stretch for this team now. They're 5-6. They're only a game out of the lead for the NFC West right now, because that division is so bunched up. I think everyone's 6-5 or 5-6. So they aren't necessarily out of it. But you mentioned they have Buffalo on Sunday night, then they host the Bears and the Rams. So the next 3 weeks, I think, will tell us a lot, really, about whether this team, goes into the last couple weeks of the season with a fighting shot at the division title, or if they're going to, just kind of start resting everybody and lay down and get ready for 2025.
Yeah, their 49ers are very lucky that their division, no one's kind of run away with that. They just continue to, beat up on everybody. We kind of get a little bit excited about the Cardinals, and then they go in and can't do anything on offense against the Seahawks. And so, yeah, they've gotten a little bit lucky in that regard. But of course, they've gotten a lot of bad luck in lots of other regards. So, certainly have to see where that goes. Another guy that missed that maybe we didn't expect to miss, and I don't really know if we have a lot on this guy, but I just want to throw out there that DeVonta Smith had missed a Wednesday practice, I believe, the week before in week 11, and then came back and ended up playing. He missed Wednesday practice again last week. And so I was kind of under the assumption that we would be following that same thing. And then he just, I believe doesn't practice the rest of the week, doesn't end up playing. Do we have any news on him, or are we just kind of, biding our time and waiting until Wednesday to figure out kind of where this is going?
No, we're kind of in wait and see mode, but I would say I would be rather, I don't know, skeptical if he's going to play this week, just because of the Eagles had a long layoff, right? Coming off that Thursday game against Washington until Sunday last night against the Rams. And he never once, got on the practice field last week. So the fact that he had 10 days and still wasn't even good enough to be a limited participant in Thursday or Friday's practice, I don't necessarily view as a good sign. Now, he's further removed from the initial injury than you normally would be, right? So hopefully that is a good sign that maybe he gets back on the field this week. But the fact that he missed practice all week last week after a bit of a longer layoff makes me think this is a longer injury. And I think it was Nick Sirianni or Kellen Moore. Someone compared it to AJ Brown's injury that he suffered back in week 2, and he missed 2 weeks with that injury before he came back. So if I had to guess, it's probably out again this week as the Eagles travel to Baltimore, and maybe it's back the following week. But we'll have to see. I mean, DeVonta Smith, for being as small and frail looking as he is, he's only missed 2 games in his career. So wouldn't be shocked if he were back this week. But if I had to bet, I would say he's probably out at least 1 more game.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that it was a Thursday game the week before, because I misspoke. He missed that Monday practice ahead of that Thursday one, then went limited, and played, and then missed the Wednesday practice, and then just kept missing this past week. So yeah, it's an interesting situation. I'm sure Tucker's going to have a bunch about DeVonta Smith and everybody coming out of the Wednesday practices in his injury column. He does that every Wednesday night, kind of updates it based on those Wednesday practices. Looks at some prognoses. Where could we end up? That's all on sharpfootballanalysis.com. Go and check that out. I will also have my waiver column up this week. I think I'm going to write a little bit about the Thanksgiving DFS slate over at Sharp Football Analysis. So, make sure you check that out. And then most importantly, if you're getting ready for this fantasy week, this, really important and exciting fantasy week that we have, no teams on bye, really in the stretch run here for the fantasy season, you can use Rich Rebar's worksheets to do that. It's the best way to get ready for the fantasy week. That's all part of our fantasy package available at sharpfootballanalysis.com. It's also part of our NFL Plus package. You can get 20% off of any of that, whichever you choose, using promo code ANGLES. So make sure you check that out. All right. One of the more interesting things we learned on Monday ahead of when we record this, and again, I should mention, we record this on Mondays at 4 p.m. Eastern on YouTube. You go over to YouTube, search Sharp Football Analysis, subscribe. You can get notified for when we go live. So we're not going to be talking about anything that happens on Monday night. So if there's an injury on Monday night, God forbid, to one of the many offensive stars that we'll see on Monday night,
You want to guess?
We're not going to discuss.
You want to guess an injury from Monday night?
I genuinely, it would be devastating to me if anybody got hurt. So I wish you all good. We need good fortune for that. But so we won't be talking about any of that. And we also, don't have like a ton of news about some of maybe the injuries. But one of the more interesting injury things we saw was Trevor Lawrence was back at practice on Monday. Jaguars coming out of their bye week, they could kind of get this extra practice. We saw Trevor Lawrence on the field. We saw him throwing. It's a obviously a very good development, but I think it's important to say that when Ian Rappaport kind of wrote about this situation on Monday, he said they will make a decision later in the week. And as you very correctly pointed out on the show last week, and I want to give you some credit for this, talking about Isaiah Pacheco and kind of the wording around him, who ended up not playing against the Panthers. A lot of times when you see that kind of, all right, we'll make our decision later in the week, this is not a given. Just because he's back at practice doesn't mean we're going to see Trevor Lawrence. But obviously this is a good development based on kind of where we thought we might be 2 or 3 weeks ago with him.
Yeah, I'd certainly thank you for allowing me to take my victory lap on Isaiah Pacheco not playing. My fantasy team suffered as a result of Andy Reid holding him out another week. But hey, at least I was right about my own suffering, so that's something. But yeah, you're right. I mean, Trevor Lawrence is kind of in a similar spot. He's dealing with that injury to his shoulder. He was on the field on Monday throwing the ball. He was at practice, but as you mentioned, they were pretty cautious, saying, well, we're not sure yet. We'll figure it out. Maybe not. So it's something where I think we probably have to wait until Wednesday or Thursday, see if he's on the field then. Maybe if he's graduating to a full participant in practice by Friday, then there's a good bet he plays. But I'll probably say it's like 60-40 shot he plays, but I certainly don't think it's a guarantee he's on the field on Sunday.
I have to say, I hope for the Jaguars' offense's sake and for fantasy's sake that he is back, because, I mean, it hasn't been a great year for Lawrence. Obviously, it's not been there have been a long line of struggles here for Lawrence since entering the league, and it has been, something of a disappointment. However, he was playing much better before the injury. He had trouble against the Eagles, but I mean, what we now know about the Eagles defense is that's just kind of a thing that's going to happen. The Eagles defense happens to be very good. Tucker will try to hide his excitement about how good the Eagles defense happens to be at this point. But from week 5 to week 9, Trevor Lawrence was 12th in EPA per play among qualified quarterbacks. And I think more importantly, given what we saw at the back end of last season and what we kind of saw at the beginning of this season, he was third in off target rate. And so that accuracy had kind of returned to him. That's obviously very important. We also have a, limited sample here over the last few weeks with Brian Thomas Jr., who's also working through his own injury. But when Trevor Lawrence was in the game, when Trevor Lawrence has played this year, Brian Thomas Jr. has a 2.43 yards per route run. And with Trevor Lawrence not playing, it's 1.76. It would be a big deal for Brian Thomas Jr., who's almost like the only receiver left standing. Obviously, they have Evan Ingram. We don't know what the running game is going to look like. I've looked and I have found nothing about Tank Bigsby and whether he practiced on Monday. I couldn't find any information about that, so we'll have to see. But ultimately, if you're invested in Brian Thomas Jr. and Evan Ingram, if you're still praying for a Parker Washington breakout like I am, if you're hoping for the running game, whoever that ends up being, whether Travis Etienne or Tank Bigsby or some combination of the two, all of that is going to be a much better situation if we get Trevor Lawrence back. And so ultimately that's the deal. Are we going to go out and use Trevor Lawrence this week? Are we going to be excited about him for fantasy? I mean, I don't really know. Like that gets a little tricky. But ultimately, for the offense as a whole and the fantasy environment as a whole, then you're much more excited if we're getting Trevor Lawrence this week.
Yeah, totally. And like you said, I don't know how high Trevor Lawrence ranks amongst quarterbacks, but I mean, without him in the last 2 games, they've scored 13 total points, right? Mac Jones has 0 touchdowns, 3 interceptions in his 2 starts this season. And obviously it's been kind of tough competition against the Detroit Lions and the Minnesota Vikings going against those 2 defenses. But they have Houston this week. I think is 8th in the league right now in points per drive allowed. So it's not necessarily easy sledding. And for that cast of characters, so they have big names, right? You mentioned Tank Bigsby, Brian Thomas Jr., even Evan Ingram has put up big numbers in the last month or so among tight ends. Just having Trevor Lawrence back just raises the floor of that offense tremendously.
And kind of continuing this quarterback run, we had another injury in week 12, which was Baker Mayfield. But it seems like he came back to the game. It seems like everything's fine here with Mayfield, right?
Yeah, I was Googling Baker Mayfield this morning, and all I found was that he's suing his dad for $12 million. And that seems to be what Baker Mayfield's worried about, not the stinger. So seems like he'll be fine. Seems like he'll be on the field.
Is that true? That's a real story? That's something that's
Bucs quarterback Baker Mayfield sues firm owned by dad after being swindled out of $12 million.
Oh, man. Money. I'm going to be very clear about this. I would rather be rich than not, but it does seem like money does some odd things to people, doesn't it? It does some odd things to people and ruin some relationships. I'm not happy to see that. What I will say is, and I believe Todd Bowles said that Mayfield is good, quote unquote good, and so like I think it's fine. I do think it's interesting, kind of with Mike Evans back last week. Mike Evans was still not like a full-time player, but he averaged 3.24 yards per out run, targeted on 28.6% of his routes. Huge numbers, exactly what you want to see from him with the schedule they have coming up, especially since you would expect as he moves further away from this injury, he will move further into being like a full-time player. I think Mike Evans is going to have a massive finish to this season. And so I'm excited to kind of see that. But if you kind of look on the other parts of the offense, Sterling Shepard ended up staying in that slot role that he had kind of with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin out. He led the team in targets despite running one fewer route than Jalen McMillan. I was kind of hopeful that Jalen McMillan would maybe take on more of those slot snaps. He did that a bit in college. It didn't seem to happen. So, maybe Shepard's going to keep that role. He'll be viable in deeper PPR leagues. The thing about Shepard is he's averaging 8.7 yards per catch this year. So it's not like it's, super valuable. Like it's kind of like a Ray McLeod situation, a Wan'Dale Robinson situation. But there are definitely leagues where those guys are valuable. And so if you're in kind of one of those leagues, that was promising usage for him. For Cade Otton, it wasn't as promising. He ended up with, I believe he got 3 targets. He was on the field a lot, but that has traditionally been the case. Cade Otton has traditionally run a lot of routes and not gotten a lot of targets whenever Mike Evans and Chris Godwin are healthy. But, since both of them are out, he was getting a ton of targets. And obviously we're getting a lot of great fantasy production from him. Now that Mike Evans is back, are we going to keep getting those targets from him? I had hoped that we would. I had hoped it was kind of be the Mike Evans and Cade Otton show. But, this 1 week sample was a bit discouraging. It's not enough to just completely jump off the bandwagon, but it was a bit discouraging. And so we'll have to see kind of how that continues on. They all are in a great spot this week against Carolina. That game is in Carolina. Carolina, obviously playing better lately, pushed the Chiefs to the brink in a game that I believe I said on the Thursday podcast, that's the most 23-20 Kansas City win I've ever seen in my entire life. Well, I didn't get the number quite right, but that's exactly how it played out. I don't know why the Chiefs do that against those teams, but here we are. But it is still a great matchup here against the Panthers, so we'll have to see how that plays out. One more quarterback injury here, Gardner Minshew, collarbone, out for the season. I think that's been confirmed now, right?
Yeah, I mean, they pretty much admitted that as soon as the game was over yesterday. And a collarbone's usually like an 8-week injury anyway, especially for a quarterback. So just the timeline doesn't match up. But as you mentioned in our pre-show notes, Aidan O'Connell, I think could be back this week. Is expected to. He's at least eligible to come back from his thumb injury this week. Currently on the IR, so it's not all bad in Las Vegas. Maybe I don't know how positive people get over Aidan O'Connell's return, but it's something. At least you have a quarterback on your roster who can suit up on Sunday.
Yeah, and I believe they've already said, I believe Antonio Pierce already said he will practice on Tuesday, so he'll be designated to return. The Raiders do play on Friday this week, on Black Friday, against the aforementioned Chiefs. Another classic 23-20 Chiefs win incoming. Although, I mean, the last time they had a big holiday meeting between these two teams, it was different. We learned about the Mahomes rules from Pierce, and those have worked out really well ever since. So congratulations. We'll see where this goes. Yeah, the thing about Aidan O'Connell, I mean, the good news is if Aidan O'Connell is back and starting, that means that Desmond Ridder isn't, and so that's a positive. I think we would. There were some of those late in the game snaps you were watching with Ridder on Sunday that were not. They weren't the most promising, but we'll kind of see where we go from there. We only have 85 dropbacks so far this season with O'Connell, so it's not like a huge sample. We're not going to make any definitive statements based on that. But Brock Bowers was targeted on 26.5 of his routes in that sample. Jakobi Meyers targeted on 32.3% of his routes. That's exactly what we want to see. Those are the two guys we want to see getting targets. I will say Trey Tucker had a good game this past week. Trey Tucker's splits with O'Connell have been bad, especially when compared to Gardner Minshew. And you even haven't even seen a lot of Trey Tucker targets recently anyway, but he wasn't getting really any targets with O'Connell, and that was with Myers missing some time. And so you're really, I don't get too excited, I don't think, about what we saw from Trey Tucker late in that game against the Broncos. And then we also have to see what happens in the backfield here, as we talked about last week, with expecting Zamir White and Alexander Mattison to miss time. The question was, are we going to see Ameer Abdullah get enough touches? He ended up with 13 touches. He did get into the end zone as a receiver, so it worked out. If you played Ameer Abdullah, which I did in a league, it ended up working out for you, and that was fine. We'll have to see what happens kind of in practice. They are on a short week again here with White and Madison. But a name I brought up last week, Sincere McCormick, I brought up last week that if we were picking somebody to kind of be more of an early down guy, given his college resume and kind of where he came from, McCormick made a lot of sense for that. He only ended up with 5 carries, so it wasn't huge. This is a terrible matchup against the Chiefs for all running backs. So I'm not saying like you're going to go out and play McCormick, but it is a name to know. If you're playing single game DFS on Friday, so and Alexander Mattison and Zamir White are still out, McCormick's a name to know. So I guess there you go. I am impressed, though, that we got to continue our run of Ameer Abdullah not getting 10 carries. We added one more game. It is now, again, as I'll say again, we have not seen Ameer Abdullah get more than 10 carries in a game since the 2017 season. So here we go. I don't expect that to change this week either against the Chiefs.
No, and I mean he did fine with his small volume of carries. He had 28 yards. He also got 5 catches for 37 yards and that touchdown he mentioned. But yeah, I mean, this is an offense that doesn't necessarily score a lot of points. And when you look at who's getting the targets, especially in the passing game, Jakobi Meyers had 15 targets and Brock Bowers had 10. And it's kind of about it. Like, other than that, if these guys aren't getting into the end zone, what's the ceiling of some of these other receivers, including Trey Tucker?
Yeah, and and I know that hurts Tucker to say.
Trust me, I know.
Supports
Trey Tucker.
He supports
Tucker scored a touchdown yesterday, I believe, against the Giants.
That's right. He did. He supports all
Tucker
Tuckers.
Kraft
That is.
had a touchdown early in that game.
That's
Justin
right.
Tucker hasn't missed a kick yet this week. Maybe he will if you're listening on Tuesday. Maybe he has missed by then, but as of right now,
Yeah.
at 4:25 on Monday, he's
How
perfect.
dare you curse? How dare you curse a fellow Tucker like that? I can't believe that you would do that. All right, let's move on to some of the receivers and running backs. One of the more interesting situations here is Josh Downs and Michael Pittman, and kind of the entire Indy receiving core. Josh Downs, shoulder injury, I believe, played through it a little bit, came back into the game. Michael Pittman, shoulder injury, played through it, came back into the game. But it seems like Downs' shoulder injury is the one that we're actually kind of worried about moving forward.
Yeah, he's pretty much already been ruled out for week 13. It came out this morning that they don't expect him to play. So expect him to be out this week, at least this week, and we'll see what happens moving forward. As for Michael Pittman, who just keeps picking up injury after injury and keeps moving forward, thanks to the incredible motivation work by his father, dealing with the back injury, dealing with the finger injury, now picks up a shoulder injury. And he basically told reporters after the game that he doesn't expect this to hinder him at all. He expects to keep playing through it. This shouldn't be an issue. So we'll see how it goes. We'll see how that actually turns out, because maybe he wakes up tomorrow and he feels a little bit more sore than he thought he would, and maybe he does need some time off. But as of right now, he seems to think that he won't be missing any time.
And the Colts do have a bye in week 14. And so that does, as we've kind of talked about, thankfully, that's our last bye week of the season. Not thankfully, it's right in the middle of the FFPC fantasy Super Bowl if you end up getting to that in any of your leagues. And there are lots of really good teams and really good offenses on bye that week. The Colts are among that list. And so, yeah, we'll have to see what happens. The Colts this week do have a pretty good matchup against the Patriots. And so it is a spot where you would be interested in using Pittman if he plays. And the other part about Pittman is kind of since he came back, there was that time where we didn't know, what was going on with him. He's obviously been dealing with the back injury, had the finger injury. We didn't know if they were maybe even going to think about shutting him down. Since then, he's come back and he's really had a resurgence. And that's even with Josh Downs in the lineup, right? And Josh Downs healthy. And so this resurgence he's seen over the past 2 weeks has been promising, targeted on 27.8% of his routes, 9.5 yards per target, showing a much better connection with Anthony Richardson than we've seen at any point over the last 2 years. In Pittman's first 9 games this season, 21.3% target rate per route, 6.4 yards per target. So we've really seen that improvement. And now we have Downs likely to sit. We have this matchup against the Patriots. It's definitely wheels up on Pittman. And then if you're looking down the waiver wire, we know what Alex Pierce is. Alex Pierce is still available out there, might get a few more targets. And then, as I mentioned, every time we have a Colts injury, we've seen Adonai Mitchell, AD Mitchell step in the lineup when another wide receiver misses, and he commands targets. He's been targeted on 29.1% of his routes so far this season. And we saw that when Pittman missed a game, that he had a very usable game. So if you're looking for targets, if you're looking for just opportunities there, Mitchell can certainly offer that if Down misses this week, as we kind of expect him to.
Yeah, like
one
you
more.
said, that was it. I had nothing.
Yeah, I realized I paused to allow you in, and then that I had said it all, and so I don't really know what I was expecting you to.
I was just going to recap what you said. So
that seems fair. That seems fair. I blame the lack of sleep for that botched transition. All right, let's do a guy that I think we think is playing this week. It is, a short week. It is Thanksgiving week, and they do play on Thanksgiving. But that is David Montgomery, left with a shoulder injury. But like everything I'm reading, I think he's going to be fine in play this week. Is that kind of what you're seeing?
Yeah, he didn't practice today. He was given a DNP. I haven't checked to see what the official word is on what they did practice, because this is a situation where it was a walkthrough, or sometimes you get an estimated walkthrough, which is the biggest joke that there is, because that's an estimation if they would have done a walkthrough. So who knows? But he got a DNP today, which certainly isn't a good sign. But he was questionable to return with that shoulder injury on Sunday. I think he was on the sideline, kind of wandering around without a helmet. He wasn't in the locker room getting treatment in the second half of that game. So I think because the score was what it was, because they were up on Indianapolis. They necessarily need David Montgomery out there in the second half. And because they have the short week coming on Thursday, I think they're probably a little bit more cautious with him than maybe they had to be. But him not practicing today certainly gives me a little pause as to what his availability will be on Thursday. Because if you had asked me an hour ago before I saw that, I would have said without a doubt he's playing. But the fact that it is something and it isn't strictly precautionary does at least give me a little pause.
Yeah, I hadn't seen the DNP yet, and so that is
That was
concerning.
9 minutes ago.
He said he would have returned to the game, and so I'm kind of just basing it on that. From a fantasy perspective, I mean, nothing really changes. If he doesn't play, you're just putting Jahmyr Gibbs into every Thanksgiving DFS lineup that you have. You're just forcing him into everyone, regardless of what the price is. I haven't had a chance to look at the price for those competitions yet, but you were just playing him. You might just do that anyway against the Bears. Like, you might just shove Jahmyr Gibbs into every lineup anyway. But yeah, that would be the one fantasy takeaway. There's not much going here. What we know is, if both of these guys are obviously great fantasy plays, Jahmyr Gibbs more so than Montgomery, but both these guys are obviously good fantasy plays every single week. But if one of them misses, they are, the other one is going to be a running back one in this running game, in this offense. And so that's really the only takeaway that you have here from a fantasy perspective. There's no waiver takeaway. You're not going after Craig Reynolds or whomever. And so this is the kind of, if he plays, great. If he doesn't, just use Jahmyr Gibbs everywhere. That's kind of where we are. A running back that situation that I think we're a lot less certain about, and in fact, maybe certain in the other way. I'm feeling pretty skeptical that we're going to see, especially Austin Ekeler this week, but probably Brian Robinson as well. Kind of, how are you viewing this situation?
Yeah, Austin Ekeler has a concussion, which, as we know, is usually a 9-day injury. So I wouldn't expect him to be back this week. We'll get a better idea come Wednesday or Thursday, seeing how far along he's progressed in concussion protocol. But Brian Robinson, I think, is the more interesting injury. He hurt his ankle in the first half. He went out, got taped up, and then aggravated it again. Was limited to, I think, 12 touches. It didn't play in the second half after he went out the second time. Dan Quinn came out today during his press conference and said they're in, quote, wait and see mode, end quote, with Brian Robinson. So that certainly isn't great. And really the only other running back on the depth chart, I think, is Jeremy McNichols is the third running back that they have. So I would imagine, if I had to guess, if I had to bet, that both Ekeler and Robinson's been bagged up the last few weeks. He's had a few other injuries that have limited him to a certain amount of snaps the last month or so, really since October. So I would bet they probably are without both of their top running backs against the Titans on Sunday.
That's kind of where I am as well. You mentioned McNichols. He is the other running back. They cut Chris Rodriguez last week, I think on Saturday last week. I would assume he's brought back. I would assume the plan was always to put him back on the practice squad. I assume he's definitely brought back now, put on the practice squad at the very least, and then they can elevate him later in the week. It is an interesting situation here because it's a terrible matchup. You mentioned they're playing the Titans. It's a terrible matchup against the Titans. We saw what the Titans did to Joe Mixon. The Titans have allowed 3.6 yards per carry to running backs this season, which is third. They've allowed 1.02 yards before contact per rush on running back carries this season. That's seventh. Since week 9, they've allowed 2.7 yards per carry to running backs, which that's first, and 0.71 yards before contact per rush, which is third. This defensive line with Simmons and Sweat, it just shuts down everything. It just shuts down these rushing attacks. This is not a spot you really would want to attack, even if Robinson was there. Maybe with Ekeler, because obviously you can get him working in the passing game, but with Robinson, this wouldn't be a spot you would want to attack anyway. If you're looking for carries, I think you will probably get those from Jeremy McNichols this week, because I do think that both of them will sit. And so if you just need, carries, they're there. Although I will say, I mean, even when Robinson has missed time, and to be fair, Ekeler has been there, but we haven't really seen a ton of work there from McNichols. He only had 14 touches in the 3 games that Robinson missed. We saw a game in that run where actually Chris Rodriguez got some work as well. But again, Chris Rodriguez was just cut. So I would bet on McNichols here from like a waiver perspective. But really, it's like you're throwing carries up against a wall and maybe hoping you get a touchdown. A very kind of Amir Abdullah situation, albeit in a much better offense. Then I think you're really getting excited about McNichols because of just how difficult this matchup against the Titans has been for running backs all season and especially over the last few weeks.
Yeah, and you won't really even get much value of him in the passing game. Right? He only has 2 catches all season, 3 targets, 2 catches, 7 yards. So it's not like he's someone who has that kind of skill set where he can be a receiver out of the backfield and at least get you some receptions in a PPR format. He strictly is just a running back, and maybe he gets a goal line carry. He's got 4 touchdowns this year. Maybe he can kind of push one over the goal line, but that's kind of what you're hoping for, right? If you're going after Jerry McNichols, you're hoping for a lot of carries. Maybe he breaks one, and maybe he finds his way into the end zone.
Yeah, I think that's really the play. It's like it's just kind of a touchdown or bust thing because I don't see him even like rushing for like 60 to 80 yards against this defense. You're hoping for the touchdown, and maybe you get it because as you mentioned, they have used him near the goal line. Even like when Brian Robinson has been active and healthy, they have used him in those areas. So that is certainly an out here for McNichols. Again, if you just need a body to fill the running back spot, there it is. Another guy that I'm pretty sure is going to sit out this week. In fact, I'm almost positive he's going to sit out this week is Romeo Doubs, who is in the concussion protocol. They're on a short week. The Packers are playing the Dolphins on Thanksgiving night. I mean, it seems very unlikely that we're going to see this guy play this week.
Yeah, there's just no way he can pass through concussion protocol in time. He was already listed as a DNP for Monday's practice, so yeah, he'll be out. They'll have the extended layoff from Thanksgiving till week 14, and we'll see you in a couple weeks, Romeo. But good news if you're Christian Watson or Jaden Reed or Dontayvion Wicks or anybody else in that offense.
Yeah, I mean, that's Dontayvion Wicks is the name, obviously, because Watson and Reed are on a lot of rosters now, especially after Watson had that big game 2 weeks ago. Didn't go quite as well this past week, but that's neither here nor there. Wicks is such an interesting case because we know that if one of the top guys is down, that he's going to be on the field. There have been 241 dropbacks this year, in which one of Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, or Christian Watson have been off the field. One or more of those guys have been off the field. Wicks has run a route on 72% of those dropbacks. He's gotten a target on 26.6% of his routes. He has a 21% team target share in kind of those situations. He's going to run a lot of routes. He's going to be on the field, and he's going to get targets. The problem is that he has averages in those kind of situations. He averaged just 4.7 yards per target with a 37% catch rate and 6 drops. We've been in this place with Wicks before where we've expected him to have a big game and to have a lot of opportunities, and it hasn't hit. He's dropped passes, and it just hasn't been there. And so you're like, all right, this is a real boom or bust situation, especially, if you're really relying on him in a starting lineup in a week with no buys. That said, volume is king. And if he's going to get this volume, he can get touchdowns, he can make big plays. We've seen him do that as well. But I do think he's a very kind of variance kind of situation. The other part of the other kind of aspect of this is, well, there are 2 more kind of interesting things here with Wicks this week. I think Wicks is one of the more interesting guys on the wire this week. First of all, the Dolphins haven't been a great matchup for wide receivers. The fewest fantasy points per game allowed to the position. They're 10th in yards per target allowed to wide receivers, and they've given up just 5 receiving touchdowns to the position all season. So it's not a great matchup here for him, at least kind of what we've seen from the Dolphins this season. The other side of it, though, is that the Packers just haven't been throwing a ton as of late. They're 27th in dropback rate since Jordan Love returned. They're 31st in neutral pass rate. They're 6% under their expected pass rate. So this is not even just like a game script thing. This has definitely been part of their plan. But we know how good the Dolphins offense has been recently, and the Dolphins could definitely push them to air it out. So it's a very interesting situation, especially if you're playing like Thanksgiving DFS. What are you going to do with this game in general? What are you going to do with this Packers passing game? Like it's a really interesting situation to me. Wicks is definitely somebody you can pick up. He's definitely someone I think you can start and kind of play that variance game, especially if you're in a deeper league. You need like a wide receiver 4 or something like that. For instance, I'm in the Scott Fishbowl. I'm most likely going to advance this week. I have Dontayvion Wicks in there. He's somebody that I can put into my lineup as kind of like a high upside, low floor play as I'm trying to, make sure that I'm in the top half of scoring. So he's an interesting, really interesting guy this week. And I'm going to have to write, I think, a lot about him in the waiver column once I finally, get down and do that this evening, because he's just a very interesting case.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of look at his last 3 weeks. He's got 6 targets, 1 catch for 25 yards. But you go back to week 4 when they were without Christian Watson. He had 13 targets, 5 catches, 78 yards, 2 touchdowns. So he has the ability to be a big part of this offense if somebody's missing. So it just is a matter of if Jordan Love can find him. But you mentioned, like, if you're in desperate need of a wide receiver, what we've seen for him when guys are out, I mean, that's kind of really the only standout game he's had this season. But if Romeo and Doubs is out, which I more than likely, almost 99% positive, he will be out. Dontayvion Wicks has as good a shot as any of any wide receiver to kind of go off this week when you talk about guys kind of in that category.
I actually have a question here in the chat. I'm kind of in this vein too about, is Jaden Reed a sit? And I mean, obviously, given what we've seen from him recently, I get the question. But this is also one of those things about just the Packers haven't been throwing. So now you're taking one more name out of the equation. And as I said, Wicks does get targets, but you are still taking Romeo Doubs out of the equation. And like I said, you would be hopeful that, this game, it's a 47.5 point total. It is in Green Bay, but hopeful that this Dolphins offense that has been better, obviously the last several weeks with Tua back, that they could push the Packers to throw more. And so it's not a great matchup, but I think you're hoping for volume here. And so ultimately, is Jaden Reed a sit? It depends on what your other options are. I am not deep enough into the week to do like a clear, I want this guy over this guy kind of thing, especially with guys that aren't available on the wire. But I would say my answer to that question would be, this is at least an environment where you can hope the Packers are going to be pushed to throw more. And if this is an environment where they're pushed to throw more, you're going to feel a lot better about Jaden Reed and, Wicks and Tucker Kraft and Romeo, not Romeo Doubs, and Christian Watson and all of that. And so that would be kind of my answer to that. All right, let's move on. There are a few other names on the waiver wire. Make sure you go over to Sharp Football Analysis on Tuesday morning. I'll have the waiver wire column posted over there. You'll read a lot about Dontayvion Wicks, lots of other names, Jeremy McNichols, lots of guys over there that I'll talk about. I do kind of want to mention 2 tight ends here because I think it's kind of an interesting position. This season it's been an interesting position. First of all, I saw on Monday that there was a report that came out that said Jake Ferguson is more of a long shot this week because of, they're on a short week again. The Cowboys obviously playing the Giants on Thanksgiving Day. We still, I don't believe we saw Ferguson practice last week, if I'm remembering correctly. If you can, look that up real quick.
No, I don't believe he did. The Cowboys did report to, I think Stephen Jones on the radio said he's a long shot, but I think they do think Brandon Cooks could be back this week. So that would be a new guy in that offense.
Yeah, that could definitely help out kind of the receiver situation. Yeah, he missed everything last week. So yeah, I don't think Jake Ferguson's going to play. That means that obviously we could see Luke Schoonmaker again. Only 4 targets this past week. Only a 60% route rate, although that we expected. If you listen to the Thursday pod with Rich and I, we kind of expected that. But he's still targeted on 20% of those routes. That just kind of seems to be what he does. He's going to get targeted when he's on the field. And this is kind of a good spot for Luke Schoonmaker. Is a good spot for the tight ends in general. The Giants allow 8.4 yards per targets to tight end. That said, they have faced the fewest targets from the position all season. They've only allowed 1 touchdown to the position. And so if you go and look at they're the second best defense against tight ends this season. But there's a little bit of a caveat to that, given who they faced, the targets they haven't faced, and the fact that they haven't allowed touchdowns. They've allowed 8.4 yards to target to tight ends. I don't think this is a bad matchup for him. Jake Ferguson went 7 catches for 49 yards against them in week 4. So I'm going to be back in on Schoonmaker this week, assuming that Ferguson doesn't play. And then one more, and I've talked about this guy the past couple weeks. he is the Marquez Valdez-Scantling and Nick Westbrook-Akine of tight ends, and that's Noah Gray. I mean, he's got another 2 touchdowns this past week. Half of his targets over the last 2 games have been touchdowns, which I'm going to go out on a limb and say is not sustainable. But he does have half of Kansas City's throws into the end zone over the last 2 games. They've been using him there. Like I said, it feels very unsustainable. But the Raiders have been a target for tight end production all season. They've given up a ton of production. Kelsey went 10 catches for 90 yards and a touchdown against them in week 8. So if you're really digging deep at tight end and you're just hoping for the best, at least Noah Gray is getting throws into the end zone and is on the field for like 60% of the routes in a matchup that we know that is susceptible to tight ends. I continue to think that is unsustainable, but I continue to think that Nick Westbrook-Akine is unsustainable, and he scored another touchdown. And I continue to think that Marquez Valdez-Scantling is unsustainable. And the only reason he didn't score a touchdown last week is because the Saints were on bye. So, what do I know? We'll have to see kind of where this goes, but it just all feels a little bit trappy to me.
Yeah, a little too much high variance. Another guy that I kind of like at this time of year is Chigoziem over in Tennessee. I mean, you look at his numbers after week 11 every year, he averages like over 9.5 yards per target following week 11. And, just put together a casual 70-yard catch and run touchdown yesterday. It's time for him to bust out of his shell at this time of year. He loves the cold. He loves Thanksgiving. It's his time to shine.
He's such an interesting kind of career because as a rookie, he comes in and he's like amazing after the catch, right? And he definitely is putting more production in than I think that was his rookie year. Definitely putting in more production than we expected based on his usage. And so we get kind of excited from a fantasy perspective. And then that just doesn't happen again, really. And we have kind of this like these kind of like bouts of production, right? Kind of in a very kind of Jonnu Smith way, I would say, is kind of where we're talking about here. But by the way, now Jonnu Smith is just a weekly starter at tight end, and he won't be in the column for the first time in a while this week because he finally got picked up by enough people. But like he's kind of in that vein. And then, like you said, he comes out this past week, has, I believe it was his only catch. I looked it up to make sure. His only catch happens to be a 70-yard touchdown. And he can definitely do that. He can produce after the catch. I think Jonnu Smith is definitely the kind of name that I would think about for him. But we haven't seen it consistently, and we don't really know kind of where the targets are going to go. Seth asked again, which Titans start for the Commanders. I mean, we'll have to see if Tajay Spears is back. But if not, you're feeling very good about Tony Pollard. If you're obviously feeling really good about Calvin Ridley and the usage we've seen from him. But other than that, I mean, like I just all of it. Chig obviously had a big game. We had another touchdown from Westbrook-Akine. I believe Tyler Boyd had a solid game as well. But I don't feel confident in any of that outside of Tony Pollard and Calvin Ridley. So that's my answer. Those are the two that I'm just going to continue to lean on and trust the volume, and trust that volume ultimately wins out for fantasy, which I am is correct more often than not, I would say, would be the fair way to say that.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's just such a high variance offense, especially with Will Levis. So unless you're targeting the guys on that offense like Pollard, like Ridley, there aren't necessarily enough targets to get me excited about anybody else in that offense.
I'm seeing if I can find over here on Pro Football Reference. There we found it. In 2022, so that was Okonkwo's rookie year, he averaged 7.9 yards after catch per reception, which is a wild number. But here we go, we're back up at 6.3. Although I would assume this year, I would guess that 70-yard touchdown might have spiked that average a little bit. All right. Once they all count. Once we've gotten to the Chigoziem part of the podcast, that's when it's time to go. So we're going to call it, exciting week. Make sure you're staying tuned to Sharp Football Analysis. Like I said, Tucker's going to have all of his injury stuff up after practices on Wednesday. I'll have the waiver column up on Tuesday. Probably Wednesday morning, I'll have something up about DFS for the Thanksgiving slate. My favorite day of the DFS calendar is Thanksgiving Day DFS. So I'm going to be really excited about playing Jahmyr Gibbs in every single lineup, and I would encourage all of you do as well. Check that out. Obviously, Rich Rebar's worksheet's available. Use promo code ANGLES, 20% off. Every package that includes his worksheet, you can get 20% off. We'll have a couple shows this week. We'll have Warren tomorrow on Tuesday. We'll have Warren again on Friday. Rich and I will not be recording a show on Thursday. I'm sorry. We're not going to be recording on Thursday morning, on Thanksgiving morning. I apologize. But we will be back the week after that. Make sure you head over to YouTube, search Sharp Football Analysis, subscribe. You get notified when we go live. Subscribe to the podcast. We appreciate all the support. And Tucker and I will be back to talk with y'all next week.